Welcome to Breaking the News Plus. On this Monday night, we want to tackle a topic that the Star Tribune started covering today, and it poses an interesting question. Senator Tina Smith, Democrat, says she's not running for re-election, so her seat opens up next year. There are two Senate spots in the state of Minnesota, right now both held by Democrats. So one would think a lot of Republicans would take advantage of that. Let's go for that seat. But so far, almost none, maybe one, two, have responded. To talk about it, Brian McClung, political analyst. He was with the Republican Party with Governor Tim Pawlenty, still an insider in that party. Brian, what is happening? Why haven't a line of Republicans said, I want to run for that seat?
Well, I'm here on your show now, Janet, to announce my candidacy. No, I'm just kidding. Can't do it. Here's the thing. The Republican Party in Minnesota has a very weak bench. The party has not, set a kind of a line of succession of candidates that are coming up through the ranks who are prepared and interested in running statewide. The candidates who are probably best positioned to run statewide are the four Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives, but all four of them are in pretty safe districts. And as they look at their political futures, they're not really interested in giving up a relatively safe seat in Congress for an absolute crapshoot running statewide as a Republican in Minnesota. And so you have a system that is not set up to get the best possible candidates in line, in position to run statewide on the Republican side in Minnesota.
Well, Brian, I'm sure you read the article today. For those watching that didn't read it, basically sets up that we've had bigger names in the Democratic Party step up early and say, like Angie Craig, Peggy Flanagan, saying they're going to run to replace Senator Smith. And when the article goes on to talk to Republicans that are known statewide, they mention your former boss, Governor Tim Pawlenty, and he's asked point blank why he won't consider it. And he says something about the process. It's about who gets the backing of the Republican Party. And he's saying he can't get it, not as a centrist Republican. Is there truth to that?
It's 100% true. I mean, this is something that Governor Pawlenty and I have talked about repeatedly. I think he said in the article that he would be interested, that he would consider running for the U.S. Senate, but he doesn't see a path for a centrist, mainstream Reagan Republican like himself. And that's crazy, right? I mean, it's crazy to think that the former two-term Republican governor of Minnesota now would not be considered by the party activists as a potential candidate for an open U.S. Senate seat. But it is the reality because he is not from the Trump MAGA wing of the Republican Party. He's from a wing that, saw candidates like Mitt Romney and John McCain and George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And that's not who the activists are interested in these days. They want a bomb thrower. They want somebody who is a true believer. And that's fine. Like, they can, dream of those types of candidates. That type of Republican is not going to win a statewide race in Minnesota. So what they're choosing now is to be in the wilderness rather than select a more mainstream, moderate style Republican who might be able to take on a Peggy Flanagan or an Angie Craig in this race. And so that's why you don't see bigger names, I think, stepping forward to run, because they just don't see a path forward where they could win the party endorsement at the convention, or even where they could win a statewide primary and be the Republican nominee.
Well, a lot of times in politics, we can talk and talk and talk, but we should listen to perhaps results. And if the Republican Party were doing that, they endorsed Scott Jensen, who was more to the right, more of a MAGA type of Republican. He lost against Governor Tim Walz in a statewide race. Royce White seems to be running for each open seat. He lost decidedly to Amy Klobuchar for her Senate seat. Royce White is the name that comes to mind and that comes to the front of the conversation when it comes to this Senate seat, but he has lost. So wouldn't the party pay attention to, if they're putting these types of people out there that are on that wing of the party and they're losing, why not change course?
Yeah, you would think that's what a reasonable person would do. I mean, we're not really talking about people that are involved in politics to be reasonable. Like that's not their motivation. That they're not there thinking about electability. They're there thinking about purity. And then the question becomes like, well, how many times in a row do you have to lose before you're willing to edge off of purity a little bit towards electability? And I guess the answer is that the delegates, the activists in the Republican Party of Minnesota are not there yet. And I would hope, as a Republican, I would wish that they would get there sooner. I'm a Republican who is not going to support Royce White. It's a Republican who thinks that Scott Jensen is not in a position where he's likely to win a statewide race. So it would be helpful for Republicans to kind of look at that and say, hey, let's find somebody a little more centrist. Now, I think you are seeing that play out in the governor's race in Minnesota. And, there are more Republican candidates who have declared in the governor's race than in the U.S. Senate race, where there's just a couple. And I think you have some who would be considered to be more mainstream or centrist. Now, they probably wouldn't want me to say that because it might hurt them with the delegates. But an example is Representative Kristen Robbins, who's multiple term state representative from Maple Grove. She's been chairing the House Committee on Fraud Investigation and State Agency Oversight. I think she's really done an excellent job kind of raising those issues and elevating that. And she's running for governor. I think, Vin Weber, who's a former congressman, was in that Star Tribune story saying, for whatever reason, it seems like people are more willing to run for governor than run for U.S. Senate under these circumstances. I think there's something to that. I think people would rather, if they're going to put themselves out there, they'd rather be at home and focus on state issues rather than run in a federal race, which is probably going to be more expensive, more fundraising, et cetera. But you are seeing, I think, maybe there is an opportunity for what I would consider to be a more mainstream candidate to make it through the governor's race. But we'll have to see how it plays out there, too.
For folks here at home who that perhaps identify as Republican and they wonder how it comes out of the convention with the nominees that come out of it, can you explain that? Because they may be a little bit in the weeds of like, well, why is this our candidate? Wasn't there someone else?
Yeah, so I mean, Minnesota is interesting because the party endorsement carries a lot of weight. And that is not true in every state. In fact, it is rare. I would say there are probably only, less than 10 states where a state party endorsement really puts a candidate on track to be the party nominee. And Minnesota is one of those, and especially here in the Republican Party. So the way the process works, precinct caucuses are on the first Tuesday in February. So on that Tuesday evening, you go to a local school or a church or a community center or wherever your local party is having their precinct caucuses. You gather, you sign in, you have conversations about the party platform, and then from that group of people that live in your precinct, so really just your neighborhood, you'll vote to elect delegates to your state House district or state Senate district convention. So then a few weeks later, the people who are elected delegates there go and gather probably on a Saturday. Probably it's the spring, the weather's starting to get nice. You got to give up a Saturday to be there. Then you elect people from that level to a congressional district convention. And then so that group gathers on a future Saturday. And then at that meeting, they elect people to the state district or to the state convention. And so ultimately you end up with about 2,000 people from around Minnesota who are true enough believers they've given up a couple of Saturdays and a Tuesday night. They're the people that are knocking on doors and making phone calls. And I mean, I love these people, right? These are people that I worked with growing up in politics, and they show up and do the hard work of politics and campaigning. And I love that and I appreciate that. My problem is that when you have 2,000 people out of a state of 4.5 million, and they are choosing, so then you have to get 60% of their votes in an endorsing process to be an endorsed candidate. So, 1,200 or so people vote for a candidate, and then that person is in all likelihood going to be the Republican nominee for governor or U.S. Senate. It's not very representative of most mainstream Republicans, people who couldn't make it for whatever reason. They were working, they had their kids' sports activities and all these other things in life. And this very small insular group, people who typically are there year after year after year, making a decision on who's going to be the party nominee. And, candidates have run against the party endorsed candidate, for governor, for U.S. Senate. But in the modern history of the Republican Party, in the last 30 years, no one has defeated an endorsed candidate for statewide office. And that includes my former boss, Tim Pawlenty. And many people have forgotten, and that's okay if you did, that Tim Pawlenty ran for governor again in 2018. He came back and said, I've been out of office for 8 years, but I still have something to give. I'd like to run again. And in 2018, Tim Pawlenty and the campaign decided not to seek the party endorsement because he got into the process late, knew that the delegates were likely to endorse somebody else, just ran in the primary. And Tim Pawlenty lost in the Republican primary for governor to Jeff Johnson, who had been a Hennepin County commissioner, got endorsed by the party for governor. So, former two-term governor with 99% name ID, raised $1 million in a month, loses in the primary after not winning the endorsement, because the people who show up to vote in the primary are kind of similar to the people that were at the endorsing convention. So it's lots of people will say, like, well, if you don't like the way it's going, you think that the party is endorsing candidates who can't win and who are out of the mainstream, then run against them in the primary and prove that. And we tried, right? We tested that theory in 2018, and Governor Pawlenty lost. Now, that's not to say that it's going to be true forever in the future. I think there is a scenario where somebody can run and win in the primary who's not endorsed, and we might see that in 2026. A couple of candidates are already saying that they're planning to run in the primary whether or not they're endorsed. So, this election could be the one where a non-endorsed Republican defeats an endorsed Republican, but the history is that it has not happened.
Because with that endorsement comes certain privileges in terms of mailers and recognition, stuff like that.
I don't even know that. But the Republican Party of Minnesota is broke and has been broke since 2010.
Broke like money, or broke like as an organization?
Well, both, but I meant it in terms of money, right?
Okay.
I mean, the Republican Party of Minnesota has fundamentally had little to no money for the past 15 years. So in the past, having that party endorsement meant having financial backing from the party, and they could do mailers and do stuff to support your candidacy, etc. That really has not been the case since 2010. It really is more, I think, that kind of stamp of approval that the party faithful have kind of said, this is our candidate. We think this is the best person for the job. And turnout in primaries, statewide primaries in Minnesota, is extraordinarily low. So in that primary where Tim Pawlenty lost to Jeff Johnson, the turnout was 14%. So it is a very small portion of voters, and in part because Minnesota primaries, were viewed as not very competitive because the party endorsement carried so much weight. So most voters kind of thought, well, the party already selected the candidate. We don't have to show up and vote in the primary.
Gotcha.
And so people didn't, especially Republicans didn't. Democrats have had better turnout, but not wildly better, more like in the range of 25% of eligible voters. So when you have that, smaller group of voters actually showing up to cast their ballot, those voters are more similar to the party delegates than not. And that's why the outcome has been that way in these past several elections.
I'll leave you with this last observation. Before I got on with you, I was having a conversation via text with a pretty prominent Republican in the Minnesota House. He's been there several terms. And I said, hey, why don't you run for U.S. Senate? He's a centrist Republican, and he said, I'm not going to be the sacrificial lamb. I've been asked by outside of the state to consider it, but I don't really think the endorsement process is fair.
Yeah, I think that's why you're not seeing very many candidates, Republican candidates, or well-known legislators, county commissioners, other people that would kind of traditionally be on the bench get in. because they think that their chances of winning the party endorsement are very slim. And they don't want to go out there and get beat up over a process that they think, isn't going to result in a positive outcome. And, Royce White is a flawed candidate, lost to Amy Klobuchar by double digits, has all kinds of, bad stuff in his past from his campaign finance reports where they're spending money at strip clubs and doing a bunch of other stupid stuff. But the delegates still seem to think that he is their kind of Republican, right? He will stand up and, say whatever he thinks and doesn't care about what the ramifications are. So he presents to them in a similar way to Donald Trump. And the delegates like that. They are attracted to somebody who is just going to be bombastic and get out there, and they're not really that concerned about winning or not, or in their hearts, they hope that that type of Republican could somehow win in Minnesota. I don't think there's any evidence that that's true, but they enjoy that style of politics. They look to Trump as kind of the bellwether for how somebody's going to act on stage like that. And so I think it makes it hard. I mean, it makes it hard for a mainstream Republican to get in a party endorsement battle with Royce White and think that you're going to be able to, because you can't out crazy him, right? He'll always go one step further or say something wilder than you ever could. So you can't play that game. And the idea that the delegates are going to say, well, we're willing to set aside our emotion and our desire for somebody who's more electable just doesn't seem to be there.
All righty then. Well, thanks for letting us inside, a little behind the scenes on what happens with parties and who gets to come to the party and all that. Brian McClung, it's always a pleasure.
You bet. Anytime, Janet. Good to see you.
That's all for Breaking the News on this Monday night. We'll see you next time.